Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts, Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show, Monster Mondays, each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of these shows at filmseizure.com. This week, I've got a pair of big-time special effect extravaganzas in the forms of robots in disguise and the fastest man alive. And of course, I'm talking about Transformers, Rise of the Beasts, and The Flash. Now, let's start with last week's release, Transformers, Rise of the Beasts. Now, I'm a fairly big Transformers fan. Growing up in the 80s, of all the classically awesome toy properties that were available to me between, say, 1980 and 1989, there were some really, really great ones in there. Be it the big ones like Smurfs or He-Man in the earlier stages of my toy-playing childhood, to the more obvious Star Wars stuff and the less-known Shirt Tales. My favorite of them all, and the one that I kept checking in on even if I was mostly out of watching the cartoons or collecting the figures throughout the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, were the Transformers. I like the toys a lot, but growing up in a situation like I did with limited funds to get any and every Transformer I could possibly want, I especially loved the more mature-toned Marvel comic book series. I still love reading those comics nearly 40 years later. I distinctly remember going to the theater by myself to watch the 1986 animated movie, the first movie I think I ever went to alone without parents or brothers. They've always been there in the back of my mind even as I grew up. I got back into the franchise big time in 2019 when the Siege toy line came along and really showed me a great deal of emphasis on keeping the look of the characters that I loved as a kid. However, in 2007, when the first Michael Bay directed film came along, I excitedly went and watched and gobbled down popcorn while explosions and crazy action happened to my face. I didn't love the way that the Transformers looked, but I felt that this was just about as good of a live action take as there could possibly be. The second movie sucked hard. I didn't see the third one in the theater, instead opting to rent it on DVD instead. It was okay, fine with action. It was a lot of chaos, but it was fine. I completely opted out of the fourth and fifth films. To this day, I've still not seen those chapters of the Michael Bay series. Then came Bumblebee in 2018. Travis Knight crafted a movie that seemed to meld the two concepts together. The things that made the kid in me still really like Transformers, and the adult in me that wanted there to be a little tougher stakes on an action and emotional scale. Man, did that movie work out really well for me. Sadly, Bumblebee released the same day as Aquaman and only a week after Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. While it did do well overseas, I kind of feel like it was crowded out by those two superhero films here in America. And it's kind of funny because that movie was originally intended on being something of a prequel to the Bayverse films, but then after the fan reaction was so solid, it was then kind of shuffled into a reboot zone of a film that would have its own sequels and its own stories. And that's where Rise of the Beast comes in. It is most decidedly a sequel to Bumblebee and has no connection to what will come along later in the Michael Bay films. It both succeeds in some ways like Bumblebee, but also fails in some other ways that the Michael Bay films did. The plot features a relatively straightforward situation. There was once a planet of Transformer offshoots called the Maximals, who transform into more animal-like creatures instead of cars and planes and such. They possess this thing called a transwarp key that allows the Maximals to travel through portals in space and time. A planet-eating planet of his own called Unicron wants this key for himself so that he can go around the universe and easily munch on planets to his heart's desire. He has heralds called Terrorcons led by Scourge. that will go out and look for this thing, and it eventually lands on Earth of the distant past. After a couple of plucky humans get involved in the affairs, the Autobots, still hiding on Earth since 1987 in the events of the Bumblebee movie, plan to use the key to return home to Cybertron and eventually discover the Maximals hiding out in Peru. They must stop the Terrorcons and from bringing Unicron to Earth to both possess the space-hopping key and to eat our planet. Now, I gave a lot of details, but at least it's relatively straightforward. There's this thing. Each faction involved in this movie has a reason to want to either possess it or keep it protected. And there are two human characters in the mix with their own desires and intentions. The human characters are fairly standard humans in these transforming alien robot movies. You have Noah, played by Anthony Ramos, who is good with tech, but is burdened by trying to help his overworked and underpaid mother, single mother, I should say, and sick little brother. Then you have Dominique Fishback as Elena, who knows a lot about artifacts, which helps out in the search for the fragments to this transwarp key. Now, together, Fishback and Ramos are good together, and they are generally very likable as two individuals in this movie. But they both have some issues in my book. First, Fishback is not given much to do. You could almost make Noah be the guy who discovers where things are and leave her out altogether. There's even another character in Noah's life, his little brother, who could be doing the things that she's doing. However, she is likable, but almost has to be placed in the circumstances in order for her to actually have things that she specifically needs to accomplish. If everything was shifted over to Noah, the plot still works. But as for Noah's character, you really do appreciate his situation that ultimately leads to him needing to flirt with stealing with cars to make money. And that's how he meets the Transformer Mirage, voiced by Pete Davidson. That's fine. The added burden of his sick little brother, unfortunately, even though I do like the actors that play Noah and his little brother, it's kind of unnecessary to have the sick brother element. It really only adds extra melodrama that at times kind of borders on, it kind of borders on saccharine. If you cut that out, you would still appreciate Noah's situation and struggle. Because of having to help out his mom at home, he had to leave the army, and leaving the army puts him in danger of not being able to appropriately use his skills to get the jobs that he can actually do. It puts that burden on him still without necessarily needing to add additional issues. You could maybe keep the sick brother and maybe cut out the struggling mother. She's doing fine, but still she needs help taking care of the brother. That would be fine. Again, all of these human characters are incredibly sympathetic and likable. It's just that some of their stories I felt was getting lost because you had to move on to the next action scene, or action scene rather. So when it comes to those human characters, their dialogue scenes, while Ramos and Fishback are those likable characters, it almost comes off as utterly unnecessary when you really just buy your tickets to this movie to see giant transforming robots punch each other into oblivion. Well, then, what about those robot character scenes? Generally, the action is pretty fantastic in this movie. The special effects are really good. One of the great things about these Transformers characters, in a way, you can kind of joke about how these Transformers are totally screwing up things, particularly in the Peru scenes where they're messing up the roads and everything. They look like they have weight. They actually look real. So the special effects are actually pretty top notch on this. I mean, you get the impression that when Optimus Prime comes in and transforms out of his truck mode, that he probably weighs several tons. You get the size, you get the weight and all of that. There are some legitimately good and thrilling action set pieces. The big climax is exactly what I wanted to go to this movie to see. So A+ for that. It was exciting. There were ebbs and flows and stakes that played out in each battle that was depicted. And that's great. Not being a huge Pete Davidson fan, I actually quite liked his work as Mirage. He's cocky, brash, and maybe blending into human society a little too well, to the point where he wants to act like almost like a Jim Carrey character. It actually works for me quite a bit. And I also quite like Ron Perlman voicing Optimus Primal, the leader of the Maximals. He's named after the great Optimus Prime, but admits that he's not the leader he thought he was. And then that is able to teach Prime something valuable about the humans. That all comes through in this measured and kind of wise tone in Perlman's voice. And of course, Michelle Yeoh is pretty good as the Giant Falcon Air Razor. My primary issues with the Transformer characters kind of comes in two forms. The first is that there are two Maximals in particular, Rhinox and Cheetor, who I felt had almost nothing to do in this movie. And it's really sad, too. These are fan favorite characters. Hell, Cheetor was the face of the Beast Wars 90s franchise. I think he's got just 2 or 3 lines of dialogue in this. He's such a background character that I found myself seeing him in the big climax and then saying to myself, oh yeah, Cheetor's in this. I kind of forgot. It's too many characters for this movie to appropriately handle, even with the roughly 135 minute runtime. It feels like this maybe should have been 2 parts. Set up the Maximals so that we can actually have more of those characters to glom onto aside from Primal and Air Razor. Then bring in the Autobots, who all have a little more personality and easily identifiable traits to their characters. There were times in which I felt the movie was kind of almost at odds with itself. It wants to be like Bumblebee and have this familial drama at the heart of the main human character situation, but then it wanted to make sure it wasn't too much like that, so it brought in the big action, but it also thought that Beast Wars was hot again after the big 25th anniversary celebration of the series recently, and wanted to represent them in live action as well. All these things were a bit much for a 2-hour movie to appropriately pull off and give us all a full, well-rounded sense of who these characters all were. One thing I certainly know about one of the characters is that it's just how maniacally bloodthirsty it seems Optimus Prime is. Now, I agree that Prime is a great leader, maybe the greatest of all the hero leads from all the 80s toy explosions. And I accept that at times he has to make tough decisions, but the live action Prime is constantly tearing people apart limb by limb and saying about things about how he wants to end them and run them through with blades and whatnot. I won't harp on this. I'm not the only Transformer fan to comment on how mega serious and grim live action Optimus Prime is, but I do find myself constantly chuckling at how much of a crazed murderer this beloved hero really is. So if you do like the Transformers movies, I mean, I'm sure you'll like this one. And if you mostly just like Bumblebee, give this a look and you'll probably find some things to like for sure. If you're not a fan of the series, this is going to do absolutely nothing for you. In the end, I am kind of ultimately of 2 completely different minds on Transformers Rise of the Beast. Transformers as a property has some issues because the media created for it, especially in animation, is mostly geared towards children, at least up to a certain age, like maybe 12 or 13. The physical stuff like the toys, models, statues, comics, etc., seems to almost be geared toward an older audience. Teenagers and up, the people who actually have the money to sustain the property. And that is also where I come in with my near 40-year appreciation of this property. However, this movie seems to kind of come across with the split personality that it's struggling with. There are elements to this that seem to be appealing to the 12-year-old in the seat a little further down the aisle from where I was in the theater, while simultaneously trying to appeal to me, the 46-year-old guy who has grown up and changed a little bit since the cartoon and Marvel comics first came along in the 80s. So here's my internal conflict of my own. As a piece of Transformers media where giant alien robots are punching and shooting and fighting each other, I think it does succeed to a certain point. It's really no more deep than it needs to be. It's typical summer movie action with big, exciting action scenes that really were really thrilling. However, on the other hand, as an adult who would like to see a little more of the deeper stuff that Bumblebee was really good at weaving into the movie back in 2018, this is an incredibly razor-thin plot. So it might seem like that I'm kind of stuck at a 50-50 split on whether or not I really liked Transformers Rise of the Beast. Well, there was one thing that I do think the movie does pretty well. It is edited to the point that it does unfortunately cut out some of the stuff I would have liked to have seen, especially with things like Cheetor and Rhinox. But the pacing and the end result does take me back to a mid-90s summer action special effects spectacular. And since this is set in 1994, that's kind of perfect. This does feel like a 90s movie, a mid-90s action movie, and that's great. So because of that one final thing that I can add to the positive column, I think I can give this movie a respectable and maybe more appreciative than it might sound high C+. I think this is easily the third best Transformers movie of the 5 that I've seen. It does some things pretty well. While, there are some things that didn't really quite land for me, I do think that this does land slightly over the 50-50 mark as far as the positive side. But now, let's zip on over to the DC Extended Cinematic Universe and check in with The Flash. After a long road full of a lot of bumps and potholes along the way, The Flash from DC Comics is finally appearing in his first solo motion picture. Well, sort of. It's kind of impossible to talk about The Flash without bringing up a few things, so I think I do need to address that first. Yes, Ezra Miller has a lot of publicity issues. They were involved in multiple conduct issues that ranged from disorderly conduct to outright assault and even burglary. So Miller's got issues. I will say that the moment that they first appeared in the Justice League movie, regardless of what anyone thinks about either version of that movie, I felt that they were pretty good and pretty well cast as Barry Allen. However, as more behavior is easier to be seen these days, and as well as addressed and dealt with in modern society, it's really important to understand that I have to try to look at this with as much separation of art and artist as possible. Anything I need to say about Ezra Miller is specifically pointed to and about their performance in The Flash, period. Any good or bad is not a reflection of their victims or anything like that. So let's just get that out of the way immediately. Two more things I think that need to be said about The Flash that will kind of pepper and color a lot of discussion around this movie is the simple fact that this was a movie that was kind of long overdue after seeds were planted in Justice League way back in 2017. As far as where that story is ultimately headed with Barry Allen and kind of appearing at one point from out of the past, and it's a whole mess in Justice League that was probably too quickly sprinkled into that movie. But it felt that this movie was going to come about as early as maybe 2019 or 2020, and then the pandemic and other internal stuff seemed to push it back to 2022, and then it got pushed again to 2023. That delay, the ultimate end result of the movie and what will happen and everything else, is the key thing above all else that will color this film. This is very much meant to be the end of the older DC extended universe that was ushered in by 2013's Man of Steel. There are a couple of movies that are still on the calendar for DC, and whether or not they are part of any new future or if it's simply a situation where they are movies getting released to avoid shelving or loss of the production cost, etc., is uncertain. Personally, knowing that James Gunn, coming off his very successful Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy at Marvel, is taking over the planning and future of the DCEU makes me very excited. I mean, for once, I'm actually ready to see what the quote-unquote distinguished competition, as Stan Lee used to call them, has planned for their movies and TV shows. So, good riddance to bad rubbish is my take on all of that. Now, of course, another thing that needs to be talked about is the return of Michael Keaton as Batman. Reprising this role for the first time in over 30 years is what I'm sure is about 90% of the people in the theater are there to see. We just had an episode of the Film Seizure podcast just this week that talks about the 1989 Batman movie, so I'll try to be brief. When that movie came out, I was 12 years old. It was a movie that, at the risk of sounding kind of silly, literally changed my life. I always liked watching movies before, but not the same way after seeing 1989's Batman. In a lot of ways, I always compared 89's Batman, for me, to 77's Star Wars for two of my brothers. When those movies came out, the three of us were basically the same age. So these are pop culture moments that left massive impressions. And I know there are better Batman portrayals, better portrayals of Bruce Wayne, and better Batman movies on paper and on film. But the 89 one, I should say, is the one that I will always be in the mood for. It's a movie like a few others from my youth that I know each line as they come up and how they're delivered. It's a movie I remember exactly where I saw it, where I sat, every single thing about that opening day movie-going experience. And I think I even know what time that showing was. So to have Michael Keaton back as Batman, even if it is just for one more go-around, even if it is as a supporting part of this movie, is basically everything to me. It's one thing I know will basically have its thumb on the scale for how I was trying to get excited and subjectively view this movie as I was going into it. But now let's look at The Flash. And I want to start by saying that this is a good little double feature for me to talk about. Growing up, I always liked Transformers, but as I read comics and collected them, especially in the adult years that I was collecting, The Flash was always my favorite DC guy. When I was a kid and buying new comics at 75 cents a pop, I got the first few issues of the new Flash series starring Wally West. That series was part of the aftermath of the Crisis on Infinite Earths mega crossover event. Barry Allen had perished and Wally was graduating from his Kid Flash moniker to the Flash. Something about his bright red costume that was basically minimalized to only have his yellow and white logo and the accents of the yellow Speed Force lightning was just really eye-catching to me. And in my 20s, when I was back to collecting comics again and first starting to kind of dabble in DC's comics, it was right around the 200th or so issue of the same series I had the first few issues of, so I jumped back in. Whenever I'm asked what superpower I'd like to have, I always say I want super speed. Being someone who sometimes hates driving, especially some distances, I would love to be able to just run there as fast as I wanted and be wherever I wanted to in a matter of split seconds. I mean, similarly, as someone who hates being crowded by people either in a small area or trapped in traffic with nowhere to go, having the Flash's powers could either help me zip through and around to basically avoid those types of situations, or, as I think he's been known to, in the comics from time to time, and it is something that he does play with in this movie, vibrate himself in a way that kind of makes him intangible. That would be a great way to get around some of those types of situations. But I am always curious and interested in whatever Flash has, going on. And when Barry Allen returned from having a bad case of being dead, I was right there to see how he was going to reintegrate back into the world and continuity that had by that time moved on from Barry Allen in favor of Wally West for the last 20 years, at least in our time frame. 20 years. That's a long time. A lot of people grew up with the character that replaced him. So there's a lot more I can say about the Flash and my appreciation for him, and there's a ton that I can talk about that makes the Flash one of the most important characters of the DC Comics universe because of how he helped not only bridge the gap between the golden and silver ages of comic books and how the publisher reconciled the various different versions of their characters and all sorts of stuff like that. But the key is that this movie is based on one of the bigger Flash stories of the last 25 years, Flashpoint. Long story short, DC Comics plan to completely and totally reboot and relaunch their entire line of comics. The best way to go about that was to use the Scarlet Speedster and his ability to visit alternate Earths and realities to accomplish that outcome. And to do this, it would require Barry Allen trying to fix a piece of his past and it having a cascading effect throughout the entirety of reality. And it would ultimately require some godlike beings to reorganize all of DC into this new reality. So yes, Barry Allen, being a character whose mother was killed when he was young and his father was convicted of that murder, has always been a character who wanted to try to fix that. It's been something of a more modern day thing that he's always lived with, as far as this weight of his mother's death and his father's conviction. It's woven into his modern backstory of becoming a forensic scientist in order to prove his father didn't kill his mother. So it's something that has more recently played with a bunch of gravitas in that character. So he figures that now he kind of has a way to do time travel, and Barry decides he's going to fix this, and he gets a little bit of a warning from his world's Bruce Wayne in this movie played by Ben Affleck that he might be able to do what he wants to do, but he doesn't know if doing this will have catastrophic effects on their reality. So that's the basic simple plot of the movie. Barry wants to go and save the life of his mother, so that he could grow up with a normal life. He talks to Bruce Wayne about it. Now, Bruce Wayne, of course, being somebody who also grew up without his parents, everybody knows that Bruce Wayne's parents were killed in an alley. They like to portray that many, many times in movies. And he's like, hey, I can do this. I can fix this. And after realizing that his father's appeal trial is probably not going to go over too well, he decides just to do it despite Bruce Wayne's protest. And the effect it has on reality is indeed catastrophic. And I found myself really enjoying this movie. Sure, there are a few things that you can say about the script and the plot, like why does Batman need to be a part of this, or why does there have to be a super person in this, with this movie having an alternate timeline where Supergirl is on Earth and not Superman, and so on. Some of that feels like it muddies the waters, kind of makes a mess of things, and takes away the fact that this really should be just a story about the Flash, seeing how his name is the title of the movie. These are valid questions anyone could ask about the movie, and it's going to get in the way of a lot of people enjoying this movie. But I found myself really liking Ezra Miller's Barry Allen. And the movie will sink or swim with audiences when it comes to the Ezra Miller part, shortly after Barry realizes that he can, in fact, run fast enough to go back in time. He realizes the one thing that could potentially save his mother from being killed when he was a kid and goes back to fix it. He then tries to return to the present to see if what he did amounted to anything. However, he's thrown out of the Speed Force by a mysterious character 10 years too early. This forces the Barry who is something like 28 or 29 as far as the regular 2023 continuity goes. And it forces him to deal with his 18 or 19-year-old self. Both of these roles are played by Ezra Miller. Early on, I was teetering a bit on like the inflection point of this dual performance from Miller. The younger Barry is incredibly annoying. He even admits as much at one point. He's immature. He's kind of an idiot. But here's the thing. He doesn't have the growth or the earlier maturation that the adult version of Barry has. And this is an excellent, ever-present physical representation of Barry's character arc right here. The older Barry knows that he had to grow up early because he didn't have his parents around. He knows that, what causes him to get his powers. He knows how to use his powers. He also knows that at this time, being that it's 2013, General Zod is about to come to Earth looking for Superman, or so he thinks, and he knows the damage and death that Zod brings with him. He's the one who is now in the position that he has to teach his younger self how to use these powers that likely took Barry literally years, and then meeting and becoming close with the likes of Bruce Wayne to actually use appropriately. He has to deal with a Supergirl who, unlike her more famous cousin, doesn't have the steady hand of the Kents to teach her the good things about the world and the adoptive world that Clark Kent had, and help her see that humans aren't all bad. He has to bring an old Bruce Wayne, again played by Michael Keaton in this timeline, out of being retired and kind of a little bit, as we first see him, a crazy hermit. He's become the guiding hand for all these other characters that were his guiding hands when he was maturing. These slightly deeper and more dramatic moments with Barry is where this movie really excels. It's the ultimate, if I only knew then what I know now scenario. However, even though all this stuff Barry did was paved with good intentions, it still leads to tragedy at a much, much higher scale. It forces Barry to have to make a heartbreaking decision because he can literally see the damage he created. And all of that is handled exceptionally well by Miller, and you really do end up feeling for Barry Allen and asking your own questions about some of the things that he does. So while I do ultimately give a pass to those questions about Michael Keaton being brought into the movie and making it a little bit more of a crowded movie for the Flash's first cinematic adventure, because Miller really is very good in this movie, carrying a lot of weight, especially with two different roles. There is one big problem with the movie that does most of the damage to its final grade that I'm going to give it. The special effects are at times downright ugly. The Flash running and doing his thing looks great. In fact, I immediately thought of how he looked running in the comics. That I felt was perfect. I generally like the idea of how the movie portrays the Speed Force when he finally got to the speed where he could slip into the past and all of that stuff. And while I did like that idea, I really didn't like the way it looked in that area. The effects on the various people looked like video game characters. I get it that you want it to kind of look like images or, no pun intended, flashes or something of moments of the past. But it really took me out of this movie. The effects just were bad. There were a couple of deepfake moments later that traipsed the line between looking better than others, but the worst effects almost looked unfinished. And I kind of hope that this is one of those situations that by the time it gets to streaming or home video, those effects are made better and cleaned up a little bit. But that aside, I like The Flash more than I was actually expecting to. Ezra Miller's performance absolutely carries this movie very nicely because they have to do it with two different performances, but as the same character at two different ages. It's actually, I mean, like, they're literally two different Barry Allens in this, and it's very well done. And for the more fun comic booky stuff, I love seeing Michael Keaton as Batman again, but he didn't ultimately steal any scenes whatsoever. That's good because it really wasn't his movie. There's nothing about his character that sours or forces me to have to think, and figure out ways to cut this movie out of his total 34-year story arc. Bringing Supergirl into the fray actually, for me, fixes some of the Man of Steel issues I had with some of the stakes and certainly with the motivation to try to kill Michael Shannon's Zod. And maybe my biggest thrill were those moments seeing DC history kind of play out in the climax. As a guy who literally finds himself thinking about Crisis on Infinite Earths at least once a day, seeing a mini crisis here was absolutely wonderful. As I think I've been able to appropriately verbalize here, I really did have a lot of fun with The Flash. I think it had equal amounts of pretty good action with some pretty good emotional beats balanced fairly well. I am going to give this a grade of a fairly solid B+. If the effects in some of the places were better, I could see myself being in the mood and gotten it into the A- or A range. But still, fun flick, and it was better than I was really kind of expecting it to be. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google, Apple, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. I'll be back in 2 weeks to talk Indiana Jones as he makes his 5th appearance on the big screen in search of the Dial of Destiny. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.